Hello and welcome back. This is the week 6 lecture. So today I would like to jump into chapter 5 of the textbook and talk about structuralism and post-structuralism. So these can be considered the linguistic approaches to literature. And they're a little bit complex. We'll go through them as best we can today. It's difficult to do all of this stuff justice in just one single chapter, but we'll do our best. So the important thing to remember about structuralism is this is a theory handed down to us from the field of linguistics. So I've talked a little bit about linguistics in the past. It is an academic field or a discipline that is in many ways related to English and literary study, but it's really a separate discipline. It refers to the scientific study of language, the history and development of language over time. So when we talk about structuralism, it originated as a linguistic theory developed by this Swiss linguist and philosopher named Ferdinand Saussure. So Saussure came up with a lot of basic ideas about the ways in which language work. He examined the structures. He examined the relationships, the systems of relationships within language. So this should sound kind of familiar. This is a little bit reminiscent of what we talked about in relation to the formalists a few weeks ago, this interest in structure and form. But the important thing to remember about Saussure is that he wasn't studying literary texts. He was more concerned with language in general and the way that language functions. So what we're going to observe over the course of this chapter is the ways that various literary scholars and critics take some of Saussure's ideas and they apply them to literary texts. So they're sort of adapting, they're using structuralism, but they're adapting it to different contexts and slightly different situations. So it's kind of important to remember that the original form of structuralism that we see was not really designed for literary study, but it would later become quite important for future scholars and critics, and we'll see some of the ways in which that happens. So just a quick rundown of kind of what structuralism is, and I want to walk through some of the basic sort of grammatical or linguistic units of language that we're all familiar with, but we need to know a little bit more about how all of this stuff is working together, how these structures are working. And that's really what structuralists are interested in first and foremost. They tend to ignore a lot of the traditional literary elements that we've been talking about. So they're not super concerned with things like plot, setting, different characters, theme. Those really aren't, those wouldn't be the structuralists' primary area of interest if they were, of course, looking at a literary text at all. They would be much more interested in linguistic structure. And a literary text could be an example of a particular type of linguistic structure. So if they were to approach a work of literature, they would not be coming at it in the same way that a formalist would, or even a new historicist would. They're not really looking for that one correct meaning or the best interpretation of a particular text. And they're not even really, as the book points out, they're not really privileging the text in sort of the traditional way. They're not placing that much authority within the text or within a particular author. To them, a literary text would function a lot like other works of art or other sort of cultural productions or what they call cultural or social phenomena. And the book offers a few other examples: landscaping, architecture, kinship, marriage customs, fashion, furniture, politics, and literature. These are all structures. These are all systems of relationships, and we can analyze those structures and better understand how they work. So all of those structures, in their own unique ways, express or deliver some kind of meaning. And structuralists would be interested in understanding how those structures work. So again, not originally designed for literature, but in time, other thinkers, other theorists are going to see ways to use some of these basic concepts of structuralism and apply them to other areas outside of linguistics. But before we leave linguistics altogether, let's just think about some of these basic terms we see on page 170 in the book. I just want to walk through these. The book defines them, so you might not need me, but I thought it might be a little helpful to spend a little more time on these terms and perhaps offer some more examples. So let's start with the lang or the language. This is the larger system shared and used by all members of a particular language community. So all of us in this class belong to a particular language community. We are all English speakers. Now, some of us might belong to multiple language communities. If you are bilingual, for example, you belong to multiple communities. You might speak multiple languages, but at the very least, we all belong to this one language community. And this makes sense, right? We all speak English. We can all communicate with one another through writing or speech because we share a common language. So the language as a sort of large unit, it is a structure. It is a system, okay? That larger language. And within that language, we're going to find more structures. So there will be structures within structures. So the large, big framework here is the overall language that we all share. So that's pretty clear. But now let's talk about the parole, or the individual word, or really any type of speech act. So the book talks about this as usually appearing as written words or spoken words. So parole, well, for us basically means a word. It can be a word that is spoken out loud or a word that is written in some kind of a text, some kind of a document, okay? So the parole is a specific application of that larger language in either speech or writing. So it's just a specific instance or utterance of that larger language. And again, it can appear in speech or in writing. Okay, so those are kind of some basic concepts. Hopefully those make sense. Now, paroles generally appear as either phonetic or semantic signs. So they'll be phonetic if they are being spoken out loud, typically, and they will be semantic if they are written down in writing. But either way, what we're dealing with is signs. We're dealing with signs, which are the ways, signs are how paroles are expressed. So signs are the way that words are actually expressed in speech or writing. And I want us to think a little bit more about the sign today, because we take this for granted, and that's actually part of Saussure's point. So Saussure was working at the end of the 19th century and the very early 20th century, and he was making some larger points about language, and he wanted to sort of argue that a lot of us don't notice certain features or certain structures at work in language because we take language for granted. We grow up speaking it, we share a language with many other people, so we don't really notice how language works. And I think this is true if we think a little bit more about the sign. We'll kind of see this. So the sign, we can think of it as a two-part mental linguistic unit. I'm not sure if the book refers to it that way, but I found this good website and they kind of break down some of this information, so I'm cribbing a little bit from that site as well. I think that's how they describe the sign. It is a two-part linguistic unit. So let's explore both parts. The first part of a sign is the signifier. Okay, so the signifier simply refers to the sound that I make when I say a word, or the image that I see when I read a word in a book or article. So pretty simple. The signifier is just the sound or the image of the word. That's it. Okay, so that's the first part of the sign, is the signifier, the sound or the image of the word. The second part of the sign is the signification, or the concept that is being signified by the signifier. So this basically just means what the word means, the definition of the word, the concept that comes to mind when we hear or speak or see a particular word. So this whole thing works best if we can actually use a concrete example. So I found this site and they use the example of Google. So let's run Google through this and see how it works. So Google is our sign. Google is a word that we can speak or write, and we are going to recognize it. So let's break Google down. Google is our sign. Okay, so let's start with the signifier. So that's the sound I make when I say Google, or again, the image that I see if I read that word in print, or even if I hear somebody else say the word. It's all kind of functioning the same way. It might be an image, it might be an auditory experience, or it might be the sound of me saying the word myself. But that's the signifier. Google, or seeing the word, or hearing the word. Okay, and then we have the signification, or the concept that the signifier is supposed to be signifying. So in other words, the definition of that word. And we know it. Google is an online search engine. We all know that. So when we put together the signifier and the signification, or the concept, when we join them together, we have a sign. We have a sort of unified, coherent linguistic unit that's going to make sense for anybody who shares a common language. So everybody who shares that that larger structure, we're all going to be able to understand what Google is, what Google means, and how people use Google. So this is how language works. Is sort of the larger point. This is how language works. All signs have these two basic components, the signifier and the signification, or the concept being signified. But as speakers, as readers or listeners, as people who speak the language and use the language every day, we don't really think about this. We don't break this linguistic unit down and really examine it in detail because it seems natural to us. And also Salcero points out that this all happens simultaneously. Like there's not a leap that we have to make from saying the word Google to then understanding what the concept means. It's automatic. As soon as I say the word, as soon as I see the word or hear the word, the concept that that signifier is supposed to signify, it's immediately in my mind, automatically. These aren't two separate steps. It's not like signifier first and then signification. It's simultaneous. So that makes humans feel like there's no difference between signifier and concept. But there actually is a difference. They're not the same, even though they kind of occur to us or wash over us at the same time. And the reason the website uses Google as an example is because Google's a relatively new word, right? Google, as we use it, did not exist 25 years ago. And if you actually look at the signifier, if you just look at the word as it's written, or you just say it out loud, Google, there's nothing in the sound that you make when you say it, and there's nothing in the appearance or the image of the word when you read it that logically connects it to the concept that it's supposed to be connected to, the concept being an online search engine. There's nothing in the word itself that's really related to an online search engine. Because the relationship ultimately between signifier and signified is kind of arbitrary. There's nothing really natural or organic about it because language is a system. It's a series of systems, really, and it's all man-made. It's all constructed, and it's not a naturally occurring thing. Nothing's inherent or natural about it. So you can do this with any word, right? So I'm sitting at a desk right now. Think about the signifier desk, how it sounds, the way the word looks. There's nothing in that word that means that it has to represent a flat writing surface on top of legs on a floor of a home. Like, there's nothing natural about that sound image. There's nothing natural about the signifier that connects it to the concept or the signification. That's an arbitrary connection. It seems natural to us because we've been using the language for so long. But really, the connection is arbitrary. It's all just a system or a structure. It's not nature, right? It's a man-made structure that can be broken down and analyzed as such. So hopefully that makes sense. So, but I just find this kind of interesting because this is not like when we think about Google or desk, that's not purely a physical event, but it's also not purely a mental event either. It's just the way language works. It's really actually kind of hard to explain it or describe it because, again, it's effortless for us. As adults who know the language, it's effortless. Even if it's not our first language, anybody who's been speaking English, even just for a few years, is going to be comfortable with Google and desk, basic, simple words like those. But there is a complicated sort of process happening, even though we're not fully aware of it. And again, this is a system. These are relationships. This is a structure within larger structures. So we have that big structure, that's the overall language. But then every single word has a structure of its own. Every single sentence, which consists of multiple words, they all have their own structures. So we have structures within structures. And again, an individual parole or a sign is only going to make sense within the larger structure of the language. Now, I think Google might be kind of a universal word that transcends language. But if we asked a speaker of French or German to sort of break down our use of desk, it's not going to work because they have a different word for desk. So again, everything comes down to structures and systems because our understanding of desk is only going to work within the larger structure of the English language. So the structure of the word desk is dependent on the larger structure of the English language. So if we take one away, the other might not work. So this is kind of what structuralism is all about. So like we say, in time, these concepts and principles get applied more and more to literature. So you can see at the bottom of page 170 a little bit of this as they explain Roman Jacobson and some of the ways that he's applying structuralism to other ideas about communication. But again, this early version of structuralism, remember, not really designed for literature. So as a result, it can sometimes only really get us at the surface level meaning of literary text. It can't always uncover those deeper, more complex meanings because we're very much at a grammatical level here. Not always necessarily what we might think of as like a conceptual or a thematic level. We're at a grammatical level. We're thinking about words. We're thinking about sentences. We're thinking about these basic grammatical or linguistic units. So it's kind of fun, but it's a bit limited, at least in this early form. But if we move ahead and we look at the Russian formalists, we see an example of how later scholars and critics are able to take some of Saussure's ideas and apply them more specifically to literature, with a few modifications made along the way, of course. So we won't spend too much time on the Russian formalists, but as the name suggests, they are somewhat similar to our American formalists, the new critics, who we learned about a few weeks back. So the Russian formalists are doing some similar things, but they are very much influenced by Saussure's theories. And they're applying them to novels and folk tales mostly, but also poetry. So they're looking at Russian literature, of course, not really American, although a lot of their ideas can very much apply to American lit, and some of them were interested in some American texts, but most of their work was obviously based on Russian literature, so we're not going to dig too deeply into it. But they made this move, this really important move that future critics would make as well. They basically say, all right, we think a literary text, a poem, a novel, a folktale, whatever, we think a literary text is kind of like a structural unit or a linguistic unit, kind of like a sign is. It's not quite the same, but it functions in a similar way. It's made up of multiple parts. We can break it down. We can analyze it. We can see how it's all put together and how it works. So that's a really important move as we kind of move away from just considering like individual signs or sentences, and now we're thinking more about literary texts, but using some of the same terminology and that same focus on structure. So like I said, a lot of them were looking at Russian folk tales, like traditional sort of myths and legends that were popular in their culture. And every culture really has its own folk tale tradition. We certainly have it ourselves. But what they were noticing is that in a lot of these traditional legends and tales, there were sort of only a certain number of plots. There were really only a finite number of different character types. They were noticing all these patterns, all these repetitions, all of these recurrences. And they began to realize that really there was a structure. There were rules. There was almost like a grammar of Russian folktales, like certain rules that had to be obeyed, certain character types, certain plots. So again, they focused on these patterns, these recurrences, and these structures. And they saw that they could break them down and analyze them just like the early structuralists were doing with, again, words or sentences. So this kind of gets us moving in the right direction. And they noticed that other literary texts had other interesting structures that could be explored. For example, poetry. They noticed that a lot of poetry tends to sort of defamiliarize language, or in other words, poetry often makes language strange. It makes language seem different than sort of the everyday typical uses of language that we might see or be more familiar with. And that's, again, as a pattern. It's not just one or two poems doing that. So again, poetry often moves away from the literal in favor of a more figurative meaning or a more complex sort of intellectual, realm. So they noticed that, again, that was a structure, that was a set of rules, that was a system, a series of relationships that they could explore. And they also made this really interesting distinction between story and plot that I just want to spend a moment on, because I think this will make sense to us, even though we're not Russian formalists. But they claim that stories, there's only so many stories, basically. Like every culture has a collection of sort of basic stories that they tell. And there's overlap between cultures, but I think we kind of know what they mean by this. Like, there's only so many different kinds of stories, right? So just think about movies is the easiest way to sort of see this point illustrated. Think about movies. A lot of stories kind of get recycled. Think about typical love stories. Many of them are very similar. The ways that, couples will meet and their courtship. Think about the coming of age story. how many different times we see that in different contexts, different settings, but it's the same basic story. Also, think about specific genres. Think about horror movies. How many stories get recycled? So when they say story, they're just talking about like the arrangement of events, often in chronological order. And these are the kinds of events that we're going to expect to find in a slasher movie or a romantic comedy, right? These are often telling similar stories. And again, their point is there's only so many stories. There's sort of a limited number that we can tell. But then we have plots, and plots are more interesting. Plots are more varied, and there can be a limitless number of plots, because plots are the rearrangement or the sort of reworking of these classic traditional stories that we all know. So they're saying this is really where the artistry comes in, because plots are the ways that individual authors take these well-known stories that have been told for a long time, and they kind of put their own original twist on the story. Or they play around with that type of story, and they might subvert our expectations. In other words, they might surprise us. And we see this, right? We see this in movies and books. This is a text that falls within a particular genre, so it makes us expect that things will happen in a particular way, and then there might be some surprises. Oh, you think the killer is going to target this person? No, actually the killer is going to go after this other person. So the genre sets you up to have certain expectations. The story, maybe, that's very common in the genre, sets you up to have those expectations. But then a good author or a good filmmaker might create a plot that features some misdirection, some surprise, or at the very least, the author's sort of own original, unique take on that classic story. So I think this kind of makes sense to us. And they're saying, we all kind of get the stories, right? The stories are pretty basic, and they're so common and well known, we don't really have to analyze them. But plots are often very complex and complicated, and they can, again, sort of like the language in poetry, they can be made to seem strange. They can be defamiliarizing. They can take things that might seem normal and make them abnormal. So that's part of the fun of literature. So again, for them, individual literary works are paroles or, signs. And then the broader idea of literature, or even specific literary genres, can function like the overall language, that larger structure that these smaller structures are operating within. So hopefully that makes sense. Let's move on and talk a little bit about Claude Levi Strauss. And again, this is sort of another step in this progression that we're charting. So Levi Strauss, a lot like Saussure, was not studying literature. He was a cultural anthropologist, but he was looking at structures. He was looking at certain structures that we could observe in different cultures. So that included literature and other artistic productions. Those were types of, those were types of structures among many other structures, but they weren't his primary focus. But we can use a lot of his ideas and apply them more specifically to literature. So again, this is another application of structuralism in a field other than linguistics. But in this case, it's still not necessarily literary study, at least not when Levi Strauss is working, but we'll use his ideas later. So again, he's an anthropologist, and he's really looking at human cultures, and he's looking at structures within human cultures, very much like Saussure was looking at structures within human language. So they're doing similar work, but on slightly different levels. Another thing to note about Levi Strauss, and they say this in the book, he's focused more on deep meaning. So Saussure and the Russian formalists were still kind of operating on more of a grammatical level. They were more focused on kind of surface level meaning, like, again, how the structures were sort of delivering meaning. And that's really what structuralists were often trying to do. They weren't really interpreting texts in quite the same ways that some of these other schools were. They were just trying to show how a particular system, whether it be a work of literature or maybe something else, because there's all these different kinds of structures, but they just wanted to show how a particular structure could conceivably express or deliver some kind of meaning. But they weren't really focused on theme, like we said, and those other literary elements in quite the same way. Although, again, the Russian formalists are moving that way by thinking more about plot and thinking more about specific features of language. So we're continuing in that progression now, and we're getting deeper. We're going beneath the surface level, because Levi Strauss is very interested in the signs that aren't said, the signs that aren't expressed. He's interested in the sort of embedded structures that we might find in various discourse, if you remember that word from last week, just sort of meaning the different kinds of narratives or texts, both written and spoken, that are circulating in a particular culture. So he's interested in the sort of embedded, the vestigial, the sort of mysterious or unspoken or sort of implied meanings or signs. So he's going for maybe a bit more of a deep reading. He's looking for more deep meaning, unlike some of these other forms of structuralism. But again, he wasn't terribly interested in literary texts. He was working more with myths and certain types of kinship ties, and he was interested in courtship rituals and these other things that you could observe in different cultures. But his work would lay the foundation, again, for some of these later applications, for some of these structuralist ideas being brought to bear on literature a bit more. So I'm going to stop part one right there, because we're just over a half hour. I think part two can stay pretty brief. We just need to cover a little bit of the French structuralists, and then we will move into deconstruction.